Ready? Let's begin. The Anunnaki Blueprint. The oldest labor dispute in recorded history isn't in a union hall or a courthouse. It is pressed into clay, fired in a kiln, and buried under the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. The Atrahasis Epic, a Babylonian text dated to approximately 1700 BC, but encoding oral traditions thousands of years older, opens not with a creation hymn, but with a complaint. The junior gods, the Igigi, had been digging canals and mining gold for 40 days straight, and they had had enough. Before the Atrahasis was written down, the Sumerian priestly class maintained a cosmology in which the Anunnaki, whose name translates roughly as those who from heaven came to earth, occupied the top tier of a divine administrative structure. Below them, the Igigi performed the physical labor of maintaining the earth. This was considered the natural order. What broke that order, according to the text, was exhaustion. The Igigi burned their tools, surrounded the house of the chief god Enlil, and refused to work. The Anunnaki needed a solution fast. The solution they arrived at was humanity. According to the text, the god Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag were tasked with engineering a substitute labor force. The process they used involved mixing divine blood with the clay of the earth, a phrase that Sumerian scholars read as mythological, and that a growing number of independent researchers read as something more literal. The resulting being was called the Adamu. It would carry the workload the Igigi had abandoned. It would mine, build, and maintain. And it would do so without asking why. What makes this text extraordinary is not its age, but its specificity. This is not a creation story about love or breath or divine spark. It is a project proposal. Enki and Ninhursag aren't creating life because it is sacred. They are solving a staffing problem. The language of the Atrahasis describes not a miracle, but a procedure, with inputs, outputs, and a stated purpose. The Atrahasis predates the Book of Genesis by over 1,000 years. The structural parallels between the two texts are so precise that most scholars of comparative religion now accept a direct line of inheritance. But Genesis edited out the labor clause. It edited out the Igigi strike, the exhausted gods, and the explicit admission that humans were built to serve. The question is not whether the stories are connected. It is what was removed, and why. The hybrid soldiers. 4 sentences. That is all the book of Genesis gives you before the flood narrative begins, and those 4 sentences have generated more theological controversy than almost any other passage in recorded religious history. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, describes the sons of God descending to take human women as wives, and the offspring of those unions becoming the heroes and giants of the ancient world. The church has spent 2,000 years explaining that away. The older texts it was drawn from didn't bother. The Hebrew term for these beings is Nephilim, which translates not as giants, but as the fallen ones, or those who fell. The implication of descent from above is built directly into the word. The book of Numbers, chapter 13, verse 33, describes the Israelite spies returning from Canaan and reporting that they felt like grasshoppers next to the Nephilim, giving the tradition its giant adjacent reputation. But the physical description was secondary to the theological problem. These were not fully human, and they were not fully divine, and that in-between status was catastrophic. The Book of Enoch, an Ethiopian Jewish text drawing on pre-flood traditions, names 200 beings called the Watchers who descended to Mount Hermon and began interbreeding with human women. It names their leader as Semyaza and lists the specific knowledge they transferred to humanity: metallurgy, enchantments, the cutting of roots, and astrology. That curriculum maps almost perfectly onto the technologies that appear suddenly in the archaeological record at the dawn of the Neolithic Revolution: bronze working, astronomical calendars, medicinal botany, with no clear developmental trail leading up to them. The Dead Sea Scrolls expanded the story further. The text known as the Book of Giants, discovered at Qumran in 1947, describes the Nephilim offspring as becoming increasingly violent, consuming first animals, then humans, then each other, in a cascade of destruction that forced divine intervention. The Anunnaki equivalent in Sumerian texts describes the same problem. The hybrid offspring of divine human unions became the Gibborim, the mighty ones, and they destabilized the labor system that humanity had been designed to maintain. The Watchers were punished. The Nephilim were destroyed in the flood, but the knowledge they transferred didn't wash away. It survived in the royal priestly classes who claimed descent from those hybrid bloodlines, who built the first ziggurats, who organized the first armies, and who insisted consistently across every ancient civilization that their authority came from blood that was not entirely human. The first replacement wasn't a new species. It was a corrective measure, and it didn't hold. The genetic anomalies. In 1928, a Peruvian archaeologist named Julio Tello excavated a series of burial sites on the Paracas Peninsula on the southern coast of Peru and pulled from the sand a collection of skulls that immediately divided the scientific community. Not because of their age, though they dated to approximately 3,000 years before the present. Not because of their number, because of their shape. The Paracas skulls are elongated in a way that cranial deformation through head binding cannot fully explain. This is the critical distinction. Head binding, the practice of wrapping an infant's skull with boards and cloth to reshape the growing bone, can alter the profile of a skull dramatically. What it cannot do is increase the skull's volume. Standard human cranial capacity averages approximately 1,350 cubic centimeters. Several Paracas specimens measure significantly above that threshold, with some reaching volumes up to 25% larger and weighing up to 60% more than a typical modern skull. Binding does not add mass. Binding only reshapes what is already there. A preliminary DNA analysis conducted on 5 Paracas skull samples, the results of which were published in a research summary by investigator Brian Forster, suggested mitochondrial DNA mutations that did not correspond to any known human, primate, or animal genetic profile. The analysis was not peer-reviewed, and mainstream physical anthropologists have challenged its methodology. But the anatomical anomalies are harder to dismiss. Several Paracas specimens display what researchers describe as a single continuous parietal plate, where standard human skulls have 2 separate parietal bones, divided by a sagittal suture. That suture is not a cosmetic feature. It is a fundamental structural element of human skull development. Its absence cannot be produced by any external binding technique. The distribution of elongated skull specimens extends far beyond Peru. Ancient Egyptian artistic depictions of Akhenaten, who ruled from approximately 1353 to 1336 BC, and of his daughters and Queen Nefertiti, consistently show dramatically elongated cranial profiles across the entire Amarna period artistic canon. Similar specimens have been recovered in Malta, Vanuatu, and Sudan, from periods that predate the known spread of head binding as a cultural practice. The mainstream explanation is that head binding was independently invented in multiple cultures, and that the Paracas specimens represent an extreme application of that practice. But if elongated skulls predate the practice, then the logic reverses. Cultures across the ancient world were not inventing a way to look unusual. They were imitating something they had already seen. The question is what they were looking at when they decided that the shape of divinity was a long, continuous cranium. The pre-flood architects. Sometime around 8000 BC, a group of people did something that no culture before or since has voluntarily done to its most sacred structure. They filled it in, not destroyed, not abandoned, deliberately, carefully, systematically buried. The site was Göbekli Tepe in what is now southeastern Turkey, the oldest temple complex ever discovered. Whoever built it decided, after thousands of years of use, that it needed to disappear. The construction of Göbekli Tepe is dated by archaeologists to approximately 11,600 years ago, predating Stonehenge by 6,000 years, predating the invention of pottery, predating the first writing systems, predating according to the standard model of human development, the organizational capacity required to build it at all. Its T-shaped limestone pillars weigh between 10 and 20 tons. They were quarried, shaped with stone tools, transported, and erected without the wheel, without metal instruments, and without any settled agricultural base that could have supported the labor force required. The nearest water source is kilometers away. Pillar 43 at the site, known as the Vulture Stone, carries a carved relief that a 2017 study published in Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry by researchers at the University of Edinburgh argued encodes a precise astronomical date. The symbols, when mapped against stellar positions, appear to mark a cometary impact event calculated to approximately 10,950 BC, a date that aligns closely with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a leading explanation for the civilizational collapse at the end of the last ice age. The Sumerian Eridu Genesis describes 8 antediluvian cities, each ruled by a king for tens of thousands of years, in a geographic region that corresponds to the northern Fertile Crescent and southern Anatolia, the same zone where Göbekli Tepe sits. These pre-flood kings are consistently described in Sumerian texts not as mythological figures, but as administrators, record keepers, and builders. The iconography of Göbekli Tepe, the headless figures, the vultures, the animals arranged in apparent hierarchies, reappears with striking consistency in Sumerian temple art constructed 7,000 years later. When Göbekli Tepe was backfilled, its builders did not collapse its pillars or deface its carvings. They covered everything with clean rubble and debris, preserving it intact beneath the soil. That is not what a culture does when it abandons a site. That is what a culture does when it wants something to survive a catastrophe it can see coming. Someone was here before the story begins, and they buried the evidence themselves. The amphibian teachers. One morning, civilization arrived. That is how the Babylonian priest Berossus described it in the 3rd century BC, drawing on Sumerian source texts that were already ancient when he copied them. Before that morning, according to Berossus, the people who would become the Sumerians lived like animals, without order, law, or knowledge. Then a being named Owans emerged from the Persian Gulf, and by the time the sun set on that first day, everything had changed. Before Owans, there was nothing that resembled organized society in Mesopotamia. What the Atrahasis and related texts describe as the pre-flood world was a chaotic, unstructured existence. The Sumerian king list acknowledges this implicitly, describing a period before the flood in which kingship had not yet descended from heaven. Civilization, in the Sumerian model, was not developed. It was delivered. The question archaeology consistently fails to answer is, who delivered it? Because the archaeological record in southern Mesopotamia shows the same abrupt pattern. There is no developmental sequence leading to Sumerian writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and architecture. They appear essentially complete. Berossus describes Owanas as possessing the body of a fish and the reasoning faculties of a man. He taught the Sumerians writing, mathematics, agriculture, the building of cities, the founding of temples, and the compilation of law, all in a single generation. The Sumerian artistic tradition depicts the Apkallu, the 7 antediluvian sages who preceded the flood, in fish-cloaked robes, holding pine cones in one hand, and the rectangular basket found in the god's handbag iconography in the other. They are the same beings. The fish robe is not decorative. It is a species identifier. The Dogon people of Mali present a parallel case that French anthropologists Marcel Griol and Germaine Dieterlen documented. Between 1931 and 1952, the Dogon possessed detailed knowledge of the Sirius star system, including the existence of Sirius B, a white dwarf star invisible to the naked eye, and its 50-year orbital period, knowledge that Western astronomy did not confirm until 1970. The Dogon attributed this information to the Namo, amphibious beings from the Sirius system who descended in a spinning craft and transferred their astronomical records to humanity. Griale's methodology has been criticized by some anthropologists, who suggest the knowledge may have been introduced rather than recorded, but the controversy itself is telling. The debate is not whether the Dogon had the knowledge, it is how they got it. The post-Diluvian Apkallu in Sumerian texts are described as 2/3 sage and 1/3 human, suggesting the amphibian teacher program continued into the second iteration of humanity. If civilization was a gift, whoever gave it had been planning the curriculum for a very long time. The artificial minds. Long before the first silicon chip, long before Turing posed his question about machine intelligence, the ancient world was already documenting the same problem, not as speculation, as history. In workshops of bronze, in tablets of clay, in Kabbalistic manuscripts, and in the verses of Homer. The question of whether you can build a mind, and what happens when that mind outgrows its purpose, appears with a consistency that does not suggest coincidence. It suggests memory. The Hebrew tradition of the Golem is rooted in the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, a Kabbalistic text dated by scholars to somewhere between the 3rd and 6th centuries AD, though its oral antecedents are considered significantly older. The Golem was created not from blood or breath, but from language, specifically from the manipulation of divine names and letter combinations encoded in the text. The most famous version, associated with Rabbi Judah Loew of Prague in the 16th century AD, produces a being of clay that is functionally human, capable of labor and protection, but lacking speech and soul. Every Golem tradition ends the same way. The being grows too powerful. The animating word is removed. The creation is unmade before it can unmake its creator. The Greek equivalent appears in two forms. Talos, described in Apollonius of Rhodes Argonautica from the 3rd century BC, was a bronze automaton built by Hephaestus to patrol the island of Crete, possessing a single vein of divine ichor running from neck to heel. Its weakness was that single vein, a kill switch built into the design. Separately, Homer's Iliad describes Hephaestus as having crafted golden maidens with intelligence, speech, and physical strength, attendants who functioned as something between servants and colleagues. Homer offers this detail without any apparent sense of impossibility. The Anunnaki texts contain a structural parallel that is rarely discussed. The Tablet of Destinies, a physical object described in the Enuma Elish, conferred the authority to direct civilization on whoever possessed it. It was not a weapon. It was a control protocol, a programmable authority that could be transferred, stolen, or destroyed. The god Zeus stole it and briefly threw the cosmos into disorder before it was recovered. The concept is identical to what a modern systems engineer would call administrative access. Every ancient tradition that describes manufactured intelligence also describes the moment it needed to be stopped. The Golem is unmade. Talos is drained. The Tablet of Destinies is recovered. The pattern is not cautionary mythology. It is operational documentation. Every culture that imagined building a mind also imagined, with great specificity, the moment it became necessary to turn that mind off. The Ant People. The Hopi people of the American Southwest do not describe their ancestors as having evolved on the surface of the earth. They describe them as refugees. In the Hopi oral tradition, the current world is the fourth world, each of the three preceding worlds having been destroyed by fire, by ice, and by flood, respectively. What saved a remnant of humanity each time was not a boat, not a mountain, not divine favor alone. It was a species that already lived underground and was willing to share what they had. The beings the Hopi call the Ant People are described as having provided shelter, food, and guidance during each of the three great destructions. Hopi oral accounts describe them as small, with large eyes, small mouths, 2 antennae, and the ability to communicate without speaking. This is not a detail added recently. It is embedded in the oldest strata of Hopi cosmological teaching, passed through generations of oral tradition by elders who treated it not as metaphor, but as ancestral memory. The phonetic parallel that researcher Gary David noted in his 2006 work, The Orion Zone, connects the Hopi term Anu Sinom, meaning ant people, to the Sumerian Anu, the sky god, whose name is embedded in the word Anunnaki. Linguistic scholars are appropriately cautious about such comparisons, and it should be treated as a suggestive parallel rather than established etymology. But the structural parallel in the traditions themselves is harder to dismiss. The Sumerian underworld, the Kur, is described not as a spiritual realm, but as a physical subterranean geography with its own inhabitants, laws, and resource systems. Physical evidence of large-scale underground habitation exists independent of mythology. The Derinkuyu underground city in Cappadocia, Turkey, is a real excavated structure capable of housing 20,000 people, complete with ventilation shafts, stables, wine cellars, and places of worship. Its origins are conservatively dated to the 8th century BC, though some researchers argue for significantly earlier phases of construction. Andrew Collins has argued, in his 2009 work Beneath the Pyramids, for a network of underground chambers beneath the Giza Plateau, consistent with Egyptian texts describing the Rostau, a subterranean region associated with the gods. The Hopi tradition does not describe the ant people as gods. It describes them as neighbors, beings who existed in parallel with the surface world and whose civilization underground was already fully functional when humanity needed somewhere to go. If the fourth world is ours, and the texts of 3 separate civilizations describe beings already living beneath the surface of it, the question is not whether the ant people exist. The question is whether they ever left. The serpent bloodline. In virtually every ancient civilization, the right to rule was not inherited through military conquest, through popular election, or through demonstrated competence. It was inherited through blood, specifically through a bloodline described, in texts from Mesopotamia to China to France, as not entirely human. The divine right of kings was not a political argument. It was a biological claim. And the oldest biological claims in the ancient world consistently trace royal descent to something with scales. The Sumerian King List, a document dated to approximately 2100 BC, records the reigns of pre-flood kings in numbers that strain credibility. Alulim of Eridu reigned for 28,800 years. Enmen-Lu-Ana ruled for 43,200 years. These are not typos or translations errors. They are consistent across multiple tablet copies. After the flood, the text notes, the kingship descended again, and the reigns immediately drop to human timescales. Something changed in the bloodline when the flood came through. What the text described before that event is a ruling class that was operating on a fundamentally different biological schedule. The Chinese Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, the mythological founder of Chinese civilization, dated to approximately 2697 BC in the Bamboo Annals, is described as having descended from the heavens and as possessing a dragon nature. The Chinese dragon is not the malevolent creature of European medieval imagination. It is a celestial, serpentine being associated with cosmic order, water, and the sky, exactly the attributes of the Anunnaki in the Sumerian framework. Huangdi did not merely rule China. He civilized it, introducing writing, medicine, and mathematics in a single reign. In medieval France, the Merovingian dynasty maintained a tradition preserved in the 7th century Chronicle of Fredegar that their bloodline descended from a sea creature called the Kinotaur, a bull-horned being from the ocean. The Merovingians were famously protective of their hair, the cutting of which was considered a ritual death of their royal power, a detail that points to a physical attribute of divine significance rather than mere ceremony. Researcher Lawrence Gardner argued across several works in the 1990s that this Merovingian serpent heritage connected directly to the Sumerian Anunnaki hybrid line, preserved through Egyptian royal succession and eventually into European dynasties. The consistent global association between serpent imagery and legitimate royal authority, the pharaoh's Uraeus cobra, the Chinese dragon emperor, the Naga kings of India, the Merovingian sea creature, represents something that convergent symbolism alone cannot explain. Every culture chose the same animal to mark the bloodline that stood above humanity. The oldest political claim in human history was not "I am stronger." It was "I am not entirely one of you." The Adamu experiment. The Sumerian texts do not describe the creation of humanity as a single successful act. They describe a process. Specifically, they describe a process that failed repeatedly before it produced something viable. The Atrahasis Epic, drawing on oral traditions from the 3rd millennium BC or earlier, records that Ninhursag and Enki created 14 birth goddesses to carry the first humans in parallel batches. 14 attempts before a working model came out the other end. Modern manufacturing calls this a development cycle. The Sumerians called it the making of the Adamu. The companion text Enki and Ninmah describes what those failed prototypes looked like. Beings that could not speak, could not hold their hands open, could not see, could not urinate. The text records Enki and Ninhursag in what scholars charitably call a mythological competition, creating increasingly non-functional human variants after consuming too much beer at a divine banquet, then arguing about whether the resulting beings had any use. It reads less like religious literature and less like a project post-mortem. The tone is one of professionals reviewing failed outputs. The genetic record adds an unsettling layer to this narrative. In a landmark 1987 paper published in Nature, researchers Rebecca Cann, Mark Stoneking, and Alan Wilson confirmed that all living human beings on Earth share a single female ancestor through the maternal mitochondrial line, a figure now called mitochondrial Eve, dated to approximately 200,000 years ago in Africa. The parallel male line, Y-chromosomal Adam, was confirmed by geneticist Spencer Wells and his collaborators to the same approximate time window. All of humanity descends from a single founding pair, in the same geographic region, at the same moment, with no clear evolutionary predecessor population to explain the transition. Mainstream science calls this a population bottleneck. The Atrahasis calls it a design specification. The most disturbing detail in the Sumerian engineering record is not the failed prototypes. It is a modification that was added after the early versions proved too long-lived. The Atrahasis explicitly describes the Anunnaki as having limited human lifespan as a deliberate corrective measure. Before this adjustment, the text implies the early humans lived on a scale approaching their creators. Mortality was not something that happened to the Adamu by accident. It was built in. A population management feature coded into the template, presumably because beings that live forever are harder to manage than beings that know their time is running out. If mortality was a design choice, if the lifespan we consider natural is actually a parameter set by someone who needed to keep the labor force cycling, then every human death is the execution of a specification, written by something that did not apply that specification to itself. The Adamu experiment didn't end when the working prototype emerged. It is still running. We are the current version. And in every engineering program in history, a current version means a next version is already being planned. The 10 successors, in the cuneiform libraries of ancient Nippur and Nineveh, pressed into clay that survived wars, floods, and the collapse of every empire that came after the people who made them. There are texts that describe what comes next, not as prophecy, not as myth, as administrative record. The Anunnaki framework does not treat humanity as the final product of creation. It treats humanity as the current model in a managed sequence that began before the flood, continued through it, and will continue past whatever threshold we are approaching now. The Book of Enoch's Watcher tradition describes 5 successive waves of hybrid beings produced by the angel-human unions, each generation more destructive than the last, until the cumulative violence of the Nephilim program forced a system-wide reset. The Popol Vuh of the Maya describes 3 failed prototype humans: the Mud People, the Wood People, and the Maize People, each deliberately destroyed by the creators when their designs proved inadequate, before the current version was finally accepted. The Hindu Yuga cycle divides human history into 4 ages, each populated by a progressively diminished human type, with the current Kali Yuga representing the final and most degraded phase before the cycle resets completely. The Norse tradition describes Ragnarok not as annihilation, but as transition, after which 2 survivors, Lif and Lifthrasir, repopulate a renewed Earth. 4 separate civilizations on 4 separate continents, with no documented contact at the time these traditions were first recorded, all describe the same operational model. Humanity exists in versions. Versions are superseded. Genesis chapter 11, verse 6, contains a line that is almost always read as a statement of divine jealousy, but reads more accurately as a statement of engineering concern. God observes the unified human population and says that nothing they propose to do will now be impossible for them. The response is not punishment. It is interference with the communication system, the sudden introduction of language barriers, which is exactly what an administrator does when a managed population starts developing capabilities that approach the administrator's own. It is a version control decision. Zecharia Sitchin's reconstructed account in the Lost Book of Enki, published in 2002, frames this moment explicitly as an Anunnaki leadership debate about whether the current human model had been allowed to develop too quickly. Whatever one makes of Sitchin's translation methodology, that framing matches the structural logic of every other ancient tradition about the relationship between the creators and the created. The created keeps advancing. The creators keep intervening, and each intervention is followed, eventually, by a new version. 6 civilizations kept the same record: the Sumerians, the Hebrews, the Maya, the Hindus, the Norse, and the Gnostics of the Nag Hammadi tradition all arrived at the same conclusion by different routes. We are not the destination. We are the current build. And if these texts are right, the only thing we don't know is what the Anunnaki have been working on since the last time they decided the current model wasn't enough. Look at what these 10 items actually form when you line them up in sequence. A labor shortage became a genetic project. That project produced failed prototypes, hybrid soldiers, anomalous skulls, and a ruling class that claimed inhuman ancestry with complete confidence. Knowledge arrived from amphibious teachers and was encoded in royal bloodlines and artificial minds and underground refuges. Civilizations before ours built temples to astronomical precision and then deliberately buried them. And across 6 independent cultural traditions, the same conclusion was recorded in clay, stone, bark, and oral memory. We are not the first attempt, and we are not the last. Every item in this list is a data point in the same argument. The pattern is not coincidence. The question is whether you are willing to follow it to its conclusion. If these 10 items changed how you see the ancient record, the channel is where this excavation continues. Subscribe and stay in the archive. And go to the comments right now with this. If the Anunnaki are running a replacement program, which of the 10 candidates on this list do you think is already here? The oldest texts humanity ever wrote were not stories. They were warnings. And we kept reading them as fiction.